أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا أبو القاسم محمد. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, and with the praise of the Holy Prophet of Islam, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Welcome to this first in the series of a presentation on the tragedy of Karbala, Imam Hussain, the grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, an icon of universal social justice. You know, the new year in Islam does not begin as it is marked with other communities. It is not a time of happiness and joy. Indeed, the new year begins with grief and sorrow. This new year begins with a call to stamp out the corruption, the evil and sin, and not to indulge in it. That is a New Year's resolution that we Muslims take as we begin our new year. Indeed, the new year, the Islamic New Year 1442, as every other year before that, begins with a call for the eradication of all forms of outer tyranny by whoever is enacting it over any oppressed individuals. So that's one dimension of it, to stand up against oppression in any shape or form. At the same time, it is to purge the inner tyranny within ourselves in order to fight our own passions and desires that pull us towards sin and aggression. So that indeed is the beginning of a Muslim New Year. Why is that so? Why do we do what we do? Well, 14 centuries ago, on the 10th of Muharram, the 10th day of the Islamic New Year, a man stood on the sand dunes of Karbala, which is in Iraq. He was bleeding from multiple wounds. He could barely stand up because he was tired, he was thirsty, he was hungry. He had not had food or water for 3 days. And since morning he carried dead bodies to his camp. He had even buried his own infant child. This man shouts out the famous words to say, is there anyone out there who will help me? Inshallah, we will go into the rest of the history. I would like to go on to say what led to this man standing on a sand dune in Karbala on that day to face his enemy. This is the beginning of the explanation of the tragedy of Karbala. What lessons can we learn from the tragedy of Karbala? So in this 6-part series, we will try and put a context within which the event of Karbala played out, resulting in an enduring social justice movement of today. So the theme for the next 6 days is a brief historical review of the tragedy of Karbala, which is the subject of this session today. And then we have the second session where what did Imam Hussain do? Who was Hussain? What did he do to preserve the prophetic mission, the mission of his grandfather, the mission and the message that his grandfather, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had brought to the world? We will also analyze during this time that it was much more than a political battle. In fact, it was not a political battle at all. It was indeed a brave stand against tyranny and oppression. And we will look at the various players in Karbala, the companions and the enemies of Imam Hussain. And we will also look in the fourth session at the critical role that was played by women in Karbala. Having done that, we will analyze that how is it that Ashura, which symbolizes the tragedy of Karbala, becomes an enduring social justice movement. And lastly, we will look at the international, at the global impact, at the humanitarian impact that the tragedy of Karbala belongs to the whole humanity. So today, let us look at a brief historical review of the tragedy of Karbala. What were the events, who were the players which made the history of Karbala? Well, let's go back to the Madinah society, the society that the Blessed Prophet of Islam had created upon his hijrah, upon his migration from Mecca to Medina, where he came and he was there for a quest for justice. The Holy Prophet tilted that balance in the Arab society, a society which was steeped into the idea of tribalism. And a fight would begin if a camel of one tribe intruded upon the property of another tribe, a battle would begin. The entire issue of tribalism was rampant, which was not allowing progress to take place. There was obviously came with the tribalism, came the issue of nepotism. Misogyny, daughters were not respected. They were buried alive. Women had no standing in society. They were the property of men. And the idea of servitude, that there were slaves within that society who had to be liberated. And the power that the message of La ilaha illallah gave, when the Blessed Prophet said that say La ilaha illallah, say that there is no God but Allah so that you may be delivered. Qulu la ilaha illallah tuflihu is what he said, so that you may be delivered. It gave the strength to a slave called Bilal, who was enslaved at that time. And when he understood the message of Karbala, the message of Tawheed, the message of La ilaha illallah, the message that the Blessed Prophet brought of that there is no other deity except Allah that you need to obey, it gave him the courage to stand up to his masters. And while he was being beaten, he would say, Ahad, one, meaning that I only succumb, I only submit to the power of one and only one, and that is Allah. That was pure monotheism in action. So this is how the balance in that society tilted. And of course, there were other vices, too many to describe at this point in time. That is not my subject. The point is that after the period of the first four caliphs in Islam, the moral principles that was brought by the Blessed Prophet were on the verge of destruction. Injustice, treachery, oppression had now become common again. And it is in that milieu, it is in that environment that Imam Hussain stands up to the corruption of the rulers of the time after the four caliphs, in the time of Muawiyah, and after him, the son of Muawiyah, Yazid. And in return, he was mercilessly slaughtered with his family in Karbala. That is the story of Karbala. Let's just review some history as we move on to understand that after the death of the Blessed Prophet, peace be upon him, in 632 AD, the expansion of Islam was on the rise. As we can see in that map, the red part was the Islamic world order from 622 to 632. And then the orange part that we see were the territories added by the first four caliphs from 632 to 661. And then after that, the Umayyad caliphs, which is in pink, added more territory. So the expansion of Islam was on the rise. It was becoming a rising power in the world. But while that was happening, the fabric of the Muslim society was also being transformed at that time. And the emphasis on the pristine and the pure principles that were brought by the Holy Prophet in the teachings of the Quran became diluted. Equity, justice, and other principles that were being brought were actually being diluted at that time. Remember, this is only 50 years after the passing away of the Blessed Prophet. Just to give us a brief timeline so we understand the era that we are talking about, that 570 to 632 was the time of the Blessed Prophet, peace be upon him. From 632 to 661 was the era of the four caliphs. And from 661, upon the death of Imam Ali, 661, the Umayyad era begins. In fact, the Umayyad era had begun even before that because Muawiyah had refused to accept the Khilafah of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And then we come to 750 to 1258 with the Abbasi era where the Abbasid overpowered the Umayyads and so on and so forth. And 1258 is, the rest, as they say, is history, the Mongols and the other empires that came after that. Our focus in these presentations is the genesis of Karbala. What were the environment? What happened? So prior to his death, the Umayyad ruler, Muawiyah, appointed his son Yazid as a successor. This was despite an agreement that he had, that he would not appoint a successor with Imam Hassan, the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And when Muawiyah dies in 680, and Muawiyah was quite clever and subtle in not seeking an oath of allegiance from Imam Hassan, for example, or Imam Hussain for that matter. But when Muawiyah died in 680, Yazid demanded that Hussein pledge an allegiance to him. When Imam Hussain refused to pledge, the tragedy and the story of Karbala begins. And as a consequence, Imam Hussain found it prudent to leave his beloved city of Madinah and go towards Mecca. This presentation is being done for an audience which may not be very familiar with the personalities in Islam, so I'll take just a few moments to introduce as to who is Hussein. He is the grandson of the Prophet of Islam. And what you see there is a brief family tree of Prophet Muhammad and his first wife Khadija. And of course, Prophet Muhammad and Imam Ali were two cousins. And Imam Ali was married to the daughter of the Prophet, the Lady of Light, Fatima. And they had Hassan and Hussein as sons and Zainab and Kulsum as the children. And it is from Imam Hussain that the lineage of the Imama of the Shias begin, down to the 12th Imam who is awaited. So Imam Ali was the Caliph. Muawiyah did not accept his Khilafah and created his own dynasty. And upon the death of Muawiyah is where the story of Karbala begins. Once again, very quickly, these are the timelines of the Umayyad rulers. Muawiyah was there from 661 to 680. And then Yazid comes from 680 to 683. He only ruled for 3 years, but the havoc that he created is just unbelievable. Muawiyah II only ruled for 1 year. And after that, we had the other lineage of Marwan, Abdul Malik, Al-Wahid. And these are the other caliphs that came after Yazid. The period that we are looking at is a period of Yazid, the Christian era, 680. So as I said, when Yazid required that Imam Hussain pay an oath of allegiance to him, Imam Hussain decides to go to Mecca to seek refuge in the Hijrah 60. And then from there, he finds that in order to avoid bloodshed in the holy sanctuary of Mecca, and also that the people of Kufa had sent letters to him asking his help and pledging their allegiance to him, he begins to travel towards Kufa to go to the people of Kufa who had promised that they would pledge allegiance to him. The map that you see are the many stops that he made going from Mecca towards Kufa, and then he was diverted to go to Karbala. And it was near Karbala that his caravan was intercepted by Yazid's army. So the journey begins, and he ends up in Karbala. And we'll see a short clip to actually give us a feel and a flavor of what really happened. But in brief, that Imam Hussain was killed and beheaded in the Battle of Karbala on the 10th of October, 680 Christian era, or 10th Muharram 61 Hijrah, by Yazid along with most of his family and companions, including Imam Hussein's 6-month-old son, Ali Asghar, was also martyred, and the women and children were taken as prisoners. Bear with me as we see a brief video of the narration that has been produced, which can save me from millions of words, because a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Just 48 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, his grandson Hussein was killed in the Battle of Karbala. Why did this battle happen, and why is it so important to Islamic history? After the fourth Caliph Ali was assassinated in 661, a power vacuum emerged, leading to Muawiyah assuming role as Caliph, despite opposition from part of the ummah who wanted Hassan, son of Ali, who was the grandson of the Prophet, as the Caliph. To avoid further bloodshed after years of conflict, Hassan signed a peace treaty with Muawiyah. This treaty stipulated that Muawiyah would not appoint a successor after him. In the year 670, Hassan was assassinated, leaving his brother Hussein to take on his duties. The treaty was breached when Muawiyah named his son Yazid his successor in 680, beginning the Umayyad dynasty. Yazid spread his power through corruption, bribery, and the use of violence. To legitimize his rule, Yazid demanded allegiance from Hussein. Hussein refused, as Yazid was openly corrupt and known to be brutal. Hussein was forced to flee Medina under threat of imprisonment and assassination. He had received thousands of letters from Kufa, Iraq, pledging support for an uprising against Yazid. Of his refusal to pay allegiance, he said, "I am ready to fight for the sole goal of seeking the reform of the ummah of my grandfather, the Prophet of Allah. I want to enjoin good and forbid evil." Hussein first went to Mecca for Hajj, but then left to avoid violence and preserve the sanctity of the holy city. Hussein departed with his family and companions to Kufa. In response to the threat of rebellion from the Kufans, Yazid dispatched the governor to Kufa to quash dissent. This led to thousands of Kufans withdrawing their support under threat of violence. As they approached Kufa, Hussein's caravan was intercepted by a battalion of Yazid's army led by a man named Hur al-Riyahi. A greater army which numbered in the thousands, led by Umar bin Sa'ad, joined him and surrounded Hussein's camp in what is now known as Karbala in modern-day Iraq. The army cut off access to water for Hussein and his family, leaving the men, women and children to suffer from days of thirst in Iraq's blistering desert heat. The army demanded allegiance from Hussein, threatening him with death. Despite all the odds, Hussein refused to back down. On the night before the battle, Hussein told his companions that they were free to leave, but they pledged to stand beside him in the face of certain defeat. The following morning, on the 10th of Muharram, known as the day of Ashura, Hussein delivered a powerful speech, reminding the opposition that he was still the grandson of the Prophet and that he still wished to leave. Moved by Hussein's speech, Hur abandoned Ibn Sa'ad's army and joined Hussein's. The battle commenced, with Hussein's 70-odd companions facing off against an army of what many historians number to be 30,000. The companions of Hussein fought group by group and were martyred on the battlefield. Eventually, Hussein was left with a handful of remaining family members. They too were killed. Hussein, now with no one beside him, pleaded with the enemy forces for water for his 6-month-old baby. The enemy responded by firing a fatal arrow at the infant, killing Hussein's child in his arms. Hussein buried the child and bid farewell to the women and children of his camp. He fiercely charged into the battlefield, where, after fighting valiantly, eventually fell from his horse and was surrounded by the enemy soldiers. The grandson of the Prophet was brutally attacked from all sides and beheaded. The enemy forces attacked and plundered the possession of the dead bodies, as well as the camp of Hussein's family. The tents were set ablaze with the women inside, which included granddaughters of the Holy Prophet. The family were taken captive by Yazid's army, later to be paraded to Damascus in Syria. The story of Karbala shook the Muslim ummah as news spread, launching several uprisings across the Muslim empire. Many argue that the Battle of Karbala forever changed the course of Islamic history. The day of Ashura is mourned globally by millions of Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, to honor the heroic stand of the Prophet's grandson, Hussein. Just 48 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, his grandson Hussein.
As we heard in that clip, that the reaction to Hussein's death was turned into a rallying cry, and ultimately it began to undermine the legitimacy of the Umayyad Caliphate. But that was not all. It actually led ultimately to the overthrow by the Abbasid revolution. This is the story of Karbala as it unfolded, as we saw, that the inequity and the injustice had become so rampant, which had begun by Yazid, that Masudi, the 10th century historian, says that in the Muslim world, or in the Muslim ummah, Yazid was like a pharaoh amongst his subjects. And that is quite a statement for Masudi to make, to try and give us a glimpse into what had happened to the noble cause that the Blessed Prophet had brought, and where Muslim leadership in those times actually went. And therefore, as the pristine values of the Quran were being flouted with impunity by those like Yazid who had usurped the leadership of the Muslim community, just 50 years after the passing of the Holy Prophet, which compelled his grandson Hussein to stand up against them for truth and justice. And this is his mission statement as he leaves Madinah in 60 Hijrah. And he said, I have not risen against Yazid in order to create corruption or discord, nor to elevate myself in the eyes of the people, nor to oppress. Instead, he said, I've only risen to rectify, to reform the affairs of the ummah of my grandfather, in that I want to invite people towards good and forbid them from evil. This was his extension and his attempt to preserve and to bring back the prophetic mission, which is something that we will talk about tomorrow in some detail. But I'd like to focus today on this presentation on the universality of this message. You know, it all started, as we saw in the clip, with Hussein's refusal to give an oath of allegiance to Yazid. For those who are not that familiar with Islamic history, this was an age-old tradition within the Arab society of doing bay'ah, as they call it, an oath of allegiance to the ruler. And this was an important thing to say who was it who pledged an oath of allegiance, which determined the validity and the rigidity of the leader, as it were. So swearing an oath of loyalty to the tribal chiefs was something that was extremely important to every ruler to bring about his own legitimacy. But here, there is a very subtle difference. Normally, it is said that Imam Hussain refused to give an oath of allegiance to Yazid. That is true. But the words that he used when he refused to pledge that allegiance give this message a universal value, because he did not say directly that I refuse to offer allegiance to Yazid. Those were not his words. His words were that the likes of me cannot give bay'ah, an oath of allegiance, to the likes of him. Here, Imam Hussain was making this a message, a stand for all times, that for a person who upholds the truth, for a person who upholds justice, cannot possibly give an oath of allegiance to somebody who was unjust, who was evil, and who did not respect the rights of other human beings. Although it's a sad fact of history that over the centuries, there has been a systematic whitewashing of the excesses of the Umayyads. Firstly, it was the court historians who tried to sugarcoat what the Umayyad caliphs had done. Many things were brought into the connection to the day of Ashura to try and dilute the message. And these diversions also served to blunt the core message that Ashura symbolizes. It symbolized then, it symbolizes today, which was a principal stand for justice against unjust rulers of all times. There are many who have tried to sugarcoat this message and try to present the Banu Umayyah in a light that they did not deserve. But these are the nuances of history, that when court historians write, they write history for those that they are paid from. For Hussein, though, and for us who remember Hussein today, 1400 years, almost 1400 years, or to be precise, 1381 years, as per the Muslim calendar, that Hussein staunchly stood against its shifting tide. His sacrifice was intended, and it did, shape the Muslim conscience. Indeed, today, if Hussein's story is correctly understood, and if it is presented, it will shake the conscience of the world. What we see today, the injustice that is rampant, what we see in our own country here in the United States, the BLM movement, the many other things that are happening around us, we can take lessons from Karbala to actually shake our own consciences. And he was able to expose the misleading path that was being introduced in the name of Islam. There were many innovations, but the main part was that the pristine value of the Quran were being misled by people with impunity. And therefore, to remind us of his mission, he says, I seek to reform. The word he used was Islah. The Arabic word used was Islah. and that I seek to reform the ummah of my grandfather. So it was a matter of principle for him. It was an armed struggle for that purpose, was never his intended route. It was not to rise against just another battle. The message or his quest was motivated by a desire to achieve social justice, to bring back the pristine values of the Quran as brought by the Blessed Prophet and as applied in the Madinah society at that time. You know, the Madinah Constitution is a wonderful document. And that document was amongst the first documents of that kind where it actually said, we the people of Medina. And there were a couple of tribes who did not sign up to the Constitution of Medina when the Blessed Prophet brought all the tribes of all the different faiths and all ethnic groups to come together to create the society of Medina. There were two tribes who refused to sign or adhere to the Medina Constitution. Despite that, they were not marginalized. They were not treated unjustly. This was the wonderful Medina Constitution and the society of Medina that Imam Hussain was trying to bring back, and he was motivated again by the quest for social justice. So here, I will try and wrap this up, that the world leaders and the world thinkers have looked at what Imam Hussain did at that time, and amongst those was Mahatma Gandhi, who aptly acknowledged this to say, I learned from Hussain how to achieve victory while being oppressed. And this was the essence, that he was killed, his family was killed in that battlefield. He sacrificed his life, he sacrificed the life of his sons, even his 6-month-old baby. But ultimately, it is Hussein who was victorious on that day in the Battle of Karbala. And this is what Mahatma Gandhi today refers to say that I learned from Hussein how to achieve victory while being oppressed. In the days to come, we will talk about the idea of the remembrance of this tragedy. There are two dimensions to it. One dimension is a societal dimension in terms of how is it that we can use the example of Imam Hussain in the Battle of Karbala. And many have looked at this and have been inspired by the story of Karbala, as Mahatma Gandhi himself was, to try and bring about change within a society which is rampant with injustice. The rising up against colonial rulers was also inspired by Imam Hussein's revolution in Karbala, amongst many other things. So we will focus on that in the days to come. But at the same time, there is an internal dimension. The internal dimension is that Karbala teaches us to also stand against another oppressor, and that oppression is within us, the oppression of our own ego, to try and move towards that which causes injustice in a society. This is where the principles of the greater good, the principles of the golden rule, all come into play, whereas human beings, we do not allow our egos to go the way of Yazid, and we allow ourselves to be inspired by the way of Hussein, to say that I must be a just person. I must be a person with compassion. I must be a person with integrity. I must be a person with empathy. And this is what Imam Hussain al-Islam espoused for us. So we owe a great debt of gratitude. There are many people in human history at leadership level, they have sacrificed so much. They have stood up and they have left an indelible footprint on the sands of time. You look at the life of Mahatma Gandhi as to what he did, amongst others. You look at Martin Luther King Jr. and the movement and what we see today. The result of that, it took a long time, but the result of that is that yes, US society is not perfect, no society is, but had it not been for the likes of Martin Luther King, then the history of this country would have been different. You look at Nelson Mandela. It's another person who has left his footprint on the sand of time in terms of somebody who was oppressed for so many years. Yet when he comes out, he creates an environment where all people in South Africa could live in relative harmony. Although when these leaders go away, in times the society reverts back, just as it did in the time of the Blessed Prophet, that only 50 years, what happened and why Imam Hussain has had to rise up. So the name of Hussain today stands for one whose supreme sacrifice against ignorance, against tyranny, against oppression, and to hold human rights, truth and justice will never be forgotten from human memory. I leave you with just a few quotes as to what some of the writers and the thinkers have looked at Karbala, have looked at Imam Hussain, have looked at this history, and this is what they have said. And we will end there with those quotes, and then we will continue tomorrow with the second session. So, first and foremost, the great thinker of the East, who imbibed the philosophy of Islam in a very unique way, the thinker and poet, philosopher, Allama Iqbal, and he said, and the words are so deep, to say that Imam Hussain uprooted despotism forever till the day of resurrection. He writes so eloquently to say that he watered the dry gardens of freedom with a surging wave of his blood. And indeed, he awakened the sleeping Muslim nation. A lot of questions arise today. Where were the other people in Arabia at that time when this atrocity was committed? Why is it that after him, people did not speak up? And how is it that over a period of time, he was able to awaken the sleeping Muslim nation? Therefore, Allama Iqbal says that verily, he becomes the foundation of the Muslim creed, La ilaha illallah, meaning there is no deity but Allah. So Hussain was the embodiment of saying that I will submit to no other authority except for the authority of Allah, except for the authority of our Creator. And this, it was the promise of the Holy Prophet when he said, Kulu la ilaha illallah tuflihu, which means that say la ilaha illallah so that you may be delivered. It is those who practice this pure idea of monotheism at a very deep level. And we will go into some of these sayings and some of the supplications of Hussain to try and understand, because it is not only about the tragedy of Karbala as to what happened on that day. It was who Hussain was before he came to Karbala and what was his stand over a period of time. The English novelist Charles Dickens said, if Hussain had fought to quench his worldly desires, then I do not understand why his sister, wife, and children accompanied him. It stands to reason, therefore, that he sacrificed purely for Islam. Of course, we know this. The idea here is to share this with the rest of the world, to see what some of the thinkers have said, because this audience is a diverse audience where we have a lot of different people who would be looking at this, watching this later on also. Thomas Carlyle, a historian, of repute. And he says, and I quote, that the best lesson which we get from the tragedy of Karbala is that Hussein and his companions were rigid believers in God. They illustrated that the numerical superiority does not count when it comes to truth and falsehood. And again, there is a lesson here that Carlyle takes, that the victory of Hussein, despite his minority, marvels me. So this is another lesson that someone has taken, which we can understand. Washington Irving was another historian, an essayist, a biographer. He said, and I quote, that it was possible for Hussein to save his life by submitting to the will of Yazid, but his responsibility as a reformer did not allow him to accept Yazid's caliphate. He therefore prepared to embrace all sorts of discomfort and inconvenience in order to deliver Islam from the hands of the Umayyads under the blazing sun on the parched land, and against the stifling heat of Arabia stood the immortal Hussein. Lebanese writer Antoine Barra says that no battle in modern and past history of mankind has earned more sympathy and admiration, as well as provided more lessons than the martyrdom of Hussein in the Battle of Karbala. In the days to come, we will look at the lessons that we learned in terms of how humanity can benefit. William Muir, a Scottish Orientalist, says that the tragedy of Karbala decided not only the fate of the caliphate, but of the Muhammadan. Excuse me for using that word. I do not want to be dishonest to the author. The idea of Muhammadan does not appeal to us because we are Muslims. We are not Muhammadans. We take offense to being called Muhammadans. But this is how the Orientalists write. My import in bringing him here is that even people like William Muir could not but help to say that long after the caliphate had waned and is appeared. So this is the fate, and this is what some of the thinkers beyond the Muslim world, there are many within the Muslim world who can be quoted. The reason for bringing this in was to see how did people from outside looking inside, what did they see for Karbala? So this is universal. His values that he brought were universal. And this is a continuation from the prophets, from Ibrahim, from Abraham, to Moses, to Jesus, to Muhammad, all the prophets. Human history has been a record of eternal struggle between right and wrong, between virtue and vice, between good and evil, between righteousness and wickedness. And Hussein's quest was a continuation of that quest by the prophets, and he brought this to a level where in Islamic history, this is called Zib-e Azim, the great sacrifice that Hussein gave for all these values that we see today. And this struggle indeed was decreed by God when prophets were sent to engage in this eternal battle. So with that said, we thank you for joining us today with this special session aimed at interfaith and intra-faith audiences to better understand the sacrifice and the tragedy of Karbala and the essence behind it. We will see you tomorrow, God willing, inshallah, and talk about Imam Hussein's sacrifice to preserve the prophetic mission. We will go in some further detail as to what was the prophetic mission in some detail or some degree of detail, and look at what did he do to preserve the great mission of his grandfather, the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, peace be upon him. With that, I wish, with the traditional Islamic greeting of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, peace be and the blessings of Allah be upon you. Thank you very much for listening.